Hello, everybody. 7 p.m. It's Terror Tuesday, and I am Dr. K. Kelsey, whatever. And I'm alone tonight. You got to put up with me for 2 hours. So, warning, warning, warning. I want to talk about some controversy. I will talk about some subjects we're interested in, but in a controversial way. How's that? I'm trying to think of how I should present this. So we talk about UFOs, we talk about aliens, we talk about ghosts, we talk about all these things that go around in the supernatural, the paranormal, the strangeness of our world, whether it be horror, imaginary friends. We spent the last couple of weeks talking about tulpas, creating an imaginary friend, and doppelgangers. All these interesting subjects and the strange things that we see and feel and witness throughout our lives. Now, before I get started on the controversial end of what this may lead to, maybe it won't. I don't know. It's according to how my 2 hours goes. Since I don't have anybody to bounce off of here, I'm doing this alone. So just bear with me, and we're going to make it through this 2 hours. I may even share at least part of an interview I had with a famous UFO person. He's now deceased, but I may do that. That could be interesting too, since I'm kind of focused on UFOs, aliens, and that sort of thing tonight. Now I want to go back to December 2020. President Trump was still President Trump. He was still in the White House. The countdown was on. He signed the last coronavirus relief bill under his administration before Biden became president. It put into motion a very interesting stipulation that had nothing to do with the coronavirus relief bill. Typically, we would call this pork, I guess. Wouldn't that fall in that line if it's kind of stuck in there? But what they stuck in here, I don't know if Trump did it himself, but what it was stuck in this coronavirus relief bill that some may not be aware of, signed in 2020, December, was a 180-day time frame in which the U.S. intelligence agencies must inform Congress everything they know about UFO sightings. And it must be in an unclassified report. Interesting. And we've had Project Blue Book. We've had other things divulged over the years, some officially and some not officially. And it sounds like the opening crawl of an unimaginative science fiction film. The report also is to include an analysis as to whether UFOs pose a threat to national security. Perhaps one day our puny primitive weapons will be used to bring democracy to a spacefaring civilization, which I would kind of doubt. We can't bring democracy to ourselves. We cannot bring. Anyway, as this deadline come to a close, public interest in UFOs started to spike once again in our history. And Trump's former intelligence director, John Ratcliffe, stated on a Fox News interview, quote, "Frankly, there's a lot more sightings than have been made public. Some of those have been declassified. And when we talk about sightings, we are talking about objects that have been seen by Navy, Air Force pilots, or have been picked up by satellite imagery that, frankly, engage in actions that are difficult to explain. Movements that are hard to replicate, that we don't have the technology for, are traveling at speeds that exceed the sound barrier without the sonic boom. So all this UFO alien abduction stuff spiked sometime in April 2020 as the Pentagon confirmed the authenticity of 3 videos that showed unidentified aerial phenomena. You may remember seeing this. These videos were shot by Air Force pilots who were judging from the recordings, if you watched it, very excited by the sight of these mysterious presence in the sky. Alien and invasion and abduction has become a popular meme as social media users have jokingly proposed that an alien invasion would be the only way to top the ever-escalating insanity and surreal news headlines of the last few years. It goes back more than just a few years. It's really, this has been something we've been dealing with for throughout history. The Facebook event, Storm Area 51, you remember that one? Can't stop all of us, which proved to be nothing more than just maybe amusing and anticlimactic, as well as a series of randomly placed art installations known as the Mysterious Monoliths. Remember that? We've got some interesting stuff going on. All this has helped propel the alien abduction mythos into the public imagination. Adding to this, in January 2021, thousands of CIA documents on unidentified flying objects were released in a massive document dump that the agency makes claim includes all their records on UFOs. And then, of course, the launching of the Space Force, an idea so silly that Netflix created a mediocre comedy series based on the concept. It only fueled more, of course, speculation. Hence, in early June, the public will be offered an official explanation regarding UFOs at 180 days, 6 months. Or perhaps the report will merely amount to a resounding shrug, deepening the mystery. But the answer might be a little closer to home than we think. On Fox News, when asked about where the identified phenomena were sighted, Ratcliffe replied, all over the world. There's been sightings all over the world, multiple sensors that are picking up these things. They're unexplained phenomena. And there's actually quite a few more than's been made public. Ratcliffe is correct. But looking at ESRI's animated map, which visualizes the data from a century of reported UFO sightings, it's clear that the vast majority of alleged encounters with extraterrestrials has occurred in the United States. Perhaps omniscient, otherworldly aliens share a deep fascination with the excesses of American culture, similar to the way in which hardcore anime fans fetishize Japan. Or maybe, just maybe, our encounters with the paranormal are shaped by our cultural values. Well, who's to say? At least we'll be a little bit more informed once the report makes its way to Congress. I guess it's safe to assume that, right? So that, yeah, it's interesting, to say the least. So we have joined the ranks, again, of bringing all this to the fore in a very interesting and fascinating way. So we got to wait till June. Even though there was a dump of files, I guess, in January, but we got to wait till June. Now, here is something else from the Washington Post, which is dated April 1st. Is this April Fool's? I don't know. The hardworking staff here at Spoiler Alerts has probably written close to 2,000 columns since coming to the Washington Post. Among those that generated a steady stream of response was one from 2019 that was headlined, UFOs exist and everyone needs to adjust to that fact. That column did not say that aliens have visited Earth. Among the things it did say was that there literally are objects flying around that no one, including U.S. Navy pilots, can identify, and we have to puzzle out what that means. In the 2 years since that column appeared, the U.S. government continues to tiptoe toward the normalization of the idea of unidentified flying objects. Last year, the Department of Defense released 3 videos. We talked about this before. Maybe you've seen those, but that brought about a new interest in this phenomenon. And then, of course, in August 2020, the Pentagon announced the establishment of an Unidentified Aerial Phenomena, UAP, task force. Well, remember we had the Blue Book. Was it the Blue Book Project? Beyond developing a new abbreviation that is less loaded than UFO, UAP, okay, the Pentagon explained the mission of the task force is to detect, analyze, and catalog UAPs that could potentially pose a threat to U.S. national security. Then 10 days ago, former Director of National Intelligence John Ratcliffe, okay, I'm getting repetitious with that, but he also gave an interview, I guess, for the New York Post. He said there are a lot more sightings than have been made public, which we just went over in another article regarding this. So for most all of us that are alive today, we have grown up and lived with the image of these grays, the flying saucer. There's probably no one, at least on our continent, alive that don't understand what these represent. Some people believe, in fact, as we've gone into the 21st century and the days keep ticking by, more and more people have come to terms with what they believe is the fact that there's got to be other life out there. Now, we got to be careful with this because UFO means unidentified flying object. Unfortunately, over the years, thanks to Hollywood and fictional novels and stories and whatnot, the term UFO got connected to aliens and flying saucers. Totally not so. If it's identified, it's no longer unidentified, is it? One of the, and there's a lot of people claim to have been abducted. They've got missing time. There's a few very prominent stories in this regard, and one of the earliest took place on September the 19th of 1961. Barney and Betty Hill. They were in New Hampshire, and they were driving on a rural highway to their home in Portsmouth. By all accounts, the Hills were an exemplary couple. He was a postman, she was a social worker, active in their community and in the civil rights movement. But on this isolated road, snaking through the White Mountains, the couple later recounted they saw a bright object that appeared to be following the car. We've heard this story countless times, haven't we? They arrived home around 5 a.m., unable to account for 2 hours of the night, but feeling that something terrible had indeed happened to them. So this is what many of you have probably already heard, the Barney and Betty Hill story of their abduction. Now, I want to use this as a lead-in to an interview I did that I'm going to use this evening to replay. Now, this was strictly a podcast. There was no okay, hold on. Well, it's just not letting me. There we go. Come on. Okay. Hold on a second. I want to get this. Figure out how to do this. There we go. So I think I want to play this. The gentleman that I interviewed at this time was Stanton Friedman, and he was kind of the founding father of this um, Barney and Betty Hill story, and also Area 51. Well, he was right there. So let's get into this, and I'm just going to do a share, and I'm going to put this on play, and let that do that. Hold on. There we go. I want to make sure I share the audio, of course, and I'm going to go to right here. So bear with me.
Blog Talk Radio.
Done also a lot of research and written a book about the Betty and Barney Hill experience. And I think, yes, he did that with Kathleen Martin, who was Betty Hill's niece. So without going any further, I'm going to bring on Stan Friedman. How are you doing this evening?
Just doing fine here in beautiful Fredericton, New Brunswick, Canada.
Have you had the privilege of losing any of the snow yet?
No, we're waiting for that distinct privilege. There's about 4 feet of snow on the lawn. I say lawn, you know, that's a euphemism. Can't see anything green here.
Well, you know, there's a lawn under there somewhere. So,
well, I'm hoping.
Are you further north than Thunder Bay?
No, we're east of Maine. east of
Okay.
73 miles east of beautiful downtown Holton, Maine. So Thunder Bay is
Okay.
further north. Yes,
And,
we're about the
great.
same as Duluth, Minnesota.
Well, that gets cold up there. Duluth, of course, is on the bottom side of the lake and further south than Thunder Bay. The first time, Stan, that I privilege of seeing the Northern Lights was actually in June and July in the summertime in Thunder Bay, Canada. So they get some cool weather, and it don't. Yeah, and it's amazed me the coldest weather I've been in that you still get a lot of mosquitoes.
Well, we don't do too bad, and we don't get any black flies like they do over in Manitoba. So it's beautiful summer. It's short. That's all.
You enjoy it while you can. Of course, you get to travel a lot. You do it a lot of lectures, so you get to escape it somewhat.
Yes.
Stan, I'm talking to you about all this. People are listening because they're interested in UFOs.
Yes. So am I interested in UFOs.
And you have made a career, pretty much, since, my goodness, I guess when you first took an interest in UFOs, I was the ripe old age of 4.
Oh, well, I was 24. So, okay.
You were 24.
Yeah, and I had no idea that I was going to wind up a full-time ufologist, to tell you the truth. I was interested because I'm curious. I was really pushed because I found an Air Force document that hadn't been mentioned in 10 books that I'd read. Project Blue Book Special Report 14, biggest study ever done. And I found a lie from the Secretary of the Air Force, and that made me angry. He said that on the basis of this study, we believe that no objects such as those popularly described as flying saucers have overflown the United States. Even the unknown 3% could have been identified as conventional phenomena or illusions if more complete observational data had been available. Well, I had the report in front of me from the University of California, Berkeley. And son of a gun, what does he mean 3%? 21.5% of the sightings couldn't be explained, completely separate from 9.3% that were listed as insufficient information. Well, I don't like being lied to. I mean, I was working under security. You tiptoe around the truth sometimes in order not to reveal classified information. But this was something else. So that stimulated me to get at the truth.
So the 3% is just a figure that he just snatched out of the air.
No, actually, it applies to a small subset of reports that had nothing to do with the big study, just 100 reports or so. And they changed the rules for the qualification. The report's fascinating. There are 200 charts, tables, graphs, and maps. I was in data heaven. One of the interesting things, or two of the interesting things, the better the quality of the sighting. There were 4 scientists who evaluated all of these. The better the quality of the sighting, the more likely to be listed as an unknown, the only ones we're interested in. And the statement often made, there's no good, well, my University of Chicago classmate, Carl Sagan, said a couple of times that there are interesting sightings that aren't reliable. There are reliable sightings that aren't interesting. And those are both true statements. But there are no interesting and reliable sightings, and that's totally false. And he gives no reference to it. I gave him a hard time about it the last time I saw him back in 1992. But what I'm trying to say is they did something even more exciting. They asked, okay, we got all this data. What's the probability that the unknowns are just misknowns? Maybe we missed the boat. They did a chi-square statistical analysis, 6 different characteristics. So we compare unknowns with knowns. Reasonable question. The results are interesting. They found that the probability that the unknowns were just misknowns was less than 1%. What he was saying simply wasn't true, was totally misleading, deceptive. And the Air Force and other agencies have continued that procedure. That was that report was in '55, when you were just a broth of a lad, to say the least. And they've been misrepresenting, they meaning the government has been, and I'm a dual citizen, so I can complain legally about both governments, Canada and the U.S. You understand?
Yeah, special rights.
Yes, and that's one of the things that drives me, is to correct the false impressions. I mean, I take issue with some of the SETI people. SETI stands for Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, they say. I say it stands for Silly Effort to Investigate, SETI, based on bad science. And so I take them to task. And you mentioned Art Bell. Well, I've done, and Coast to Coast Radio, I've done debates on Coast to Coast. One with Dr. Seth Shostak of the SETI Institute. And I won the debate. 57% for me, according to the vote at the end of the program. 43% for him, and 10% said, I don't know who won. I've taken on Dr. Michael Shermer, who's head of the Skeptic Society. I got 80% of that vote because he didn't know anything. So I'm a crusader, if you want to put it that way.
Well, you're very.
I think facts are important.
Yes, and you're very unique. When I was a kid, my mother's brother, my uncle, used to come over to the house in the evening in North Alabama, and he would talk about UFOs. And I was, needless to say, a preteen at that point. And I guess I don't remember him talking. Of course, back then Roswell was unknown, I guess, to most people. It didn't catch on till much later. But for whatever reason, he was interested in UFOs. And of course, little kid, I kind of paid attention. It tweaked my interest, to say the least. And of course, I've always had, I'm like you, questioning mind. And I remember when SETI came out, and first of all, I was fascinated, but then I shifted, and I think that you and I agree on this, that how can we be so big-headed or bold to think that we know what frequency or how they even communicate?
Well, that's right. And one of my mantras is that technological progress comes from doing things differently in an unpredictable way. The future is not an extrapolation of the past. Our first long-distance radio signal was 1901. I mean, I don't use a slide rule anymore. I did when I was young and working in industry. But times change. Technology changes. To think the aliens are stuck at our level of communication when we live in a neighborhood that's over 4 billion years old doesn't make any sense to me. I realize some people say the world was created in 4004 BC. I beg to disagree. So I look around, and the notion that aliens are trying to send us radio signals, they can't get here, you understand. That's one of the basic tenets. Can't get here, right. But some people say we shouldn't let them know we're here. We shouldn't send signals because they might do damage to us. Well, if they could do damage to us, that means they can get here, and they could have gotten here 1,000 or 1,000,000 years ago. It makes no sense. And they refuse to look at the references in their books. I read their books. They don't read mine. Flying Saucers in Science, for example, which gets into the question, can you get here from there and stuff like that. It's amazing. You're interested in extraterrestrial intelligence, but we ignore all the data that indicates that it's coming here. Of course, if they're coming here, who needs to listen with a radio telescope? Maybe you need sign language? That would do it
better. I've listened to, you talked, of course, you were a schoolmate of Carl Sagan.
Yes.
Nowadays, we listen to Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Yes.
Very smart, very well spoken. I really enjoy his lectures. But then he will admit that there's got to be life out there. But then he'll turn around and mock, from my understanding, he mocks the idea that they're visiting.
Well, that's right. There are two things that he said that really aggravate me. One of them, he was saying the proof that the government can't keep secrets is how much we know about Bill Clinton's genitalia. I'm presuming
Yes.
there's no children listening. And that's pretty darn silly. There's an enormous amount of evidence indicating cover-up. I mean, I got 156 top secret Umbra UFO documents from the National Security Agency. You remember those guys, NSA, never says
Yes.
anything, you know. The only trouble with these documents is you can read one sentence per page. Everything else is whited out. National security. The CIA, we got blacked out documents. You can read 6 words here on this page, 8 words on that page. I even have one page where it says deny in toto. Not one word can you read on that page. It's all blacked out. And people say they're not covering up. And also, a very significant document that hasn't had enough attention. Go back to 1969. The University of Colorado study, the Condon Report, had recommended that the Air Force Project Blue Book be canceled. That was ostensibly the only Air Force group concerned with UFOs from about 1952 on. Now we're in 1969. And so they asked an Air Force general, a good engineer named Carol Bolender, who had nothing to do with Project Blue Book. He had been working on, of all things, a lunar excursion module. And of course, we landed on the moon in 1969. So his first assignment after that is, what should we do about Project Blue Book? So he's an engineer. He took a careful look at, and he put out a memo, which we didn't see until 10 years later. And in the memo, he says, moreover, reports of UFOs which could affect national security are made in accordance with JNAP, Joint Army Navy Air Force Publication, JANAP, 146, or Air Force Manual 55-11, and are not part of the Blue Book system. What an astonishing statement. 2 paragraphs later, he says, if we close Project Blue Book, the public won't have a place to report UFO sightings. However, as previously noted, we will continue to investigate them using the procedures designed for that purpose. Now, the Air Force has denied having anything to do with UFOs since they closed Blue Book as a result of this memo in 1969. So I don't like that kind of deception.
There's a lot of double speak.
Yeah, at least double, maybe triple, quadruple speak.
Yeah.
And that bothers me, and I think the public is entitled to know. And I've spent much of my life, just like with Roswell. I began the civilian investigation in the mid-'70s, totally unexpectedly. I had no preconceived notions about it. And I was at a television station. And to promote a lecture I was giving at Louisiana State University that night in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And I was supposed to do 3 interviews. I did 2. The third interviewer was nowhere to be found. No cell phones back then. This is 1978. And out of the blue, the station manager said, the guy you ought to talk to is Jesse Marcel. Brilliant investigator that I am. I said, who's he? Oh, he handled wreckage of one of those saucers you're interested in when he was in the military. What? Where did that come from? He was serious. There was nobody around. He wasn't making a joke. So what do you know about him? Well, he lives over in Houma. Well, that didn't tell me anything because I didn't know where Houma was. He was in the military. And you ought to talk to him. Good man. And the reporter finally showed up while he was entertaining me, giving me coffee, looking at his watch. And the next day from the airport, after a great response at Louisiana State University, I'd called information. This is before the internet. I realize some people listening don't know that there was a time before the internet, but called information, got a number for Jesse, talked to him. He told me his story. And the most important thing about Jesse is who he was. He was the intelligence officer for the most elite military group in the entire world. And I don't say that lightly. It was the 509th. Why were they unique? They dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They dropped 2 more the next year in Operation Crossroads in the Pacific. There was nobody else in the world, including the Russians, who at that time had ever, touched a nuclear weapon. So you don't pick idiots for that job. His boss, the base commander, Colonel Blanchard, went on to be a 4-star general and vice chief of staff of the United States Air Force when he died of a massive heart attack. So we're not dealing with dinks here, with people who were twiddling their thumbs with nothing better to do than to make up a story. And an article went out. It appeared in papers across the country from Chicago West because of the timing of the release from New Mexico. This was in Roswell, New Mexico. The article went out on July 8th, 1947. Less than a few hours later, the Air Force put out a new article, not from Roswell, but from the headquarters of the 8th Air Force, the 509th. It was part of the 8th Air Force, who's headquartered in Fort Worth, Texas. Oh, sorry, Ramey empties Roswell saucer, said the article. The first sighting that got attention, Kenneth Arnold's case, was only 2 weeks before, June 24th, 1947. So a temporary blip on the screen, and that was the end of that. And so I shared this with a colleague. To make a long story short, in the next year and a half, we located 62 people in conjunction with the Roswell incident. First book came out in 1980, and that's what it was called, the Roswell incident. And we located more. By 1986, it was up to 92. My book came out at the end of the 90s, Crash at Corona, because the town, nothing happened in Roswell. It happened about 75 miles northwest of Roswell. You have to understand New Mexico. There's a lot of nothing in New Mexico. It had very low population density. That's why we tested our first atomic bomb in New Mexico, Trinity site near Alamogordo. That's why we were firing the captured German V-2 rockets. You don't do either one of those things, atomic bombs or fire rockets, where there are a lot of people around, obviously. So New Mexico was kind of a special place. 2 of the 3 nuclear weapons labs in the United States were in New Mexico. And they love me in Roswell. And I will be there for anybody listening. You're welcome to attend the annual festival, first weekend in July. At the museum, there'll be thousands of people there. I'll be there signing books and stuff like that, giving lectures. There'll be a bunch of us giving lectures. And it seems only fitting, this will sound, it's a strange story, but the base was closed after Lyndon Johnson won the presidential election in 1964. He closed it the next year and moved it to Texas. And why did he do that? Because New Mexico didn't vote for Lyndon in the 1964 election. It seems only fitting that the biggest tourist attraction in the state, Roswell, benefit because of the government, the people's interested in cover up and what happened and so forth. After the government really put a knife in their back, they did. It's a great place. They got a 13,000-foot runway, which is huge. And it was the headquarters for, retaliation to the Soviet Union and so forth, big B-36s and all that sort of thing. And then suddenly they closed the base. The German Air Force used to fly there because they don't have much room in Germany for flying airplanes, for being able to maneuver and do all the other things you want to do. So it's a strange story, but it's a very significant event. Now, it isn't the only crash. At about the same time, over in the plains of San Augustine, 100 miles west, another one went down. And would you believe, in Aztec, New Mexico, up in the northwest corner, in March of 48, the Aztec incident took place. And so, obviously, aliens were interested in New Mexico. But you can understand why. There wasn't any place else to go where there'd been an atomic bomb tested, and where rockets were being fired. And, people forget how big an increase there's been in our control of energy. It's kind of a strange way to put it, but bigger bombs. Just to give you an example, I mean, I'm a nuclear guy and proud that we have exploded bombs, but it does point the way toward, if you want a lot of energy, like to come here from the stars, for example, a big bomb in 1944 was a 10-ton blockbuster. Took a huge B-29 to carry that. Released the energy of 10 tons of dynamite. Make a big hole in the ground, I'll tell you that. Okay, the first atomic bomb was 1945, July. Released the energy of 15,000 tons of dynamite. And in 1952, our first hydrogen bomb, a nuclear fusion device, they upped the ante. 10 million tons of dynamite in one bomb, which is mind-boggling. I mean, the fireball was 3 miles wide, and it wasn't tested in New Mexico. It was tested out on an island in the Pacific, sort of half annihilated the island. But the Russians then upped it, their biggest one a few years later, 50 million tons of TNT. It's mind-boggling. And the reason I bring this up is because you can use nuclear fusion for propulsion and fission as well. I get a lot of people, the ancient academics and fossilized physicists, who say you can't get here from there. They're thinking of chemical rockets, for goodness sakes. Well, I don't think in terms of chemical rockets. The submarines, we got submarines that can go around the world underwater. During World War II, they could stay under for a day. You need air for the diesels, you understand, not for the people. We can take care of that. You realize we have nuclear-powered aircraft carriers that can operate for 18 years without refueling, which is incredible. But I bring it up for a reason. Big mothership, aircraft carriers are big. They carry about 75 little airplanes, which aren't nuclear powered and operate for 2 hours without refueling if you're lucky. So we got starships coming here from other stars in the local neighborhood. There's a couple thousand stars within 54 light years, so you don't need to go too far. Not other galaxies from other stars. The next big galaxy is 2 million light years away, and I don't care about them. But we know, in other words, we know how to go if you got the dough. And such programs are expensive, and I don't think we should go, because we should have a system that represents the planet. And if there's one thing we don't have, is somebody who speaks for the planet Earth. Nationalism is the only game in town. You may have noticed that with the war.
That and religion, unfortunately. Very, and I've heard you speak about this before. And so, what has prevented us from tapping into this for our space travels?
Well, we've come much closer with nuclear fission. I worked for Westinghouse on fission rockets, and Los Alamos built one, and Aerojet General built one in the late 60s. And the Los Alamos one was less than 8 feet in diameter, and it operated at a power level of 4,400 megawatts. The power level of Hoover Dam is 2,000 megawatts. This is a little nuclear rocket engine, twice the power of Hoover Dam. Think about that for a minute.
Yeah.
And that was successful back then, in the late 60s. I worked on one for Westinghouse Astronuclear Lab, only 1,100 megawatts, half the power of Hoover Dam, less than 7 feet in diameter. This would double or triple the payload to Mars, for example. That's nuclear fission. That's what goes on in the submarines and the aircraft carriers. I worked on a study of fusion for deep space travel way back in 1962. I mean, we've joined the community of planets, if you will, that have tapped into the energy of the stars. Almost all the energy in the universe is produced by nuclear fusion. That's what happens in the stars. So the problem is money and goal. You can see the advantages of a nuclear submarine. It's kind of nice to be where nobody can find you. That's useful militarily. And as an aircraft carrier, it's useful not to need refueling for 18 years. Nope, not many gas stations out there, in other words. But fusion would be very expensive, and who's gonna pay for it? And
Right.
it should be a planetary mission, if you will. And we don't seem to be much in the way of interested in planetary anything, really. Look at the environment. You know,
Mhm.
we're people, the young generation, I don't know what they learned in school, but in World War II, we nice guy Earthlings killed 50 million of our own kind. We destroyed
Right.
700 cities. We're not nice guys. And surprisingly to most people, we have actually exploded 2,000 nuclear weapons on this planet. Only 2 of them on people, thank goodness. But 2,000 total explosions, nuclear weapons. So, from an alien viewpoint, I would put one word there. They want to quarantine us. Who would want us out there? You know, if you
That
were
would
an
be one
alien, would
thing.
you want us out there? You know,
And
think about
and
that.
and the flip side, which of course in our age, the time we grew up, going to the moon and so forth, all these things are very exciting. But as I matured and really thought about it, we're just going to take wherever we go, we're going to take the same problems with us until we learn to get it right here. We're just carrying these problems around the universe, if you will.
You mean we're a primitive society whose major activity is tribal warfare?
We're one step above animals, I think. So,
You think we've made it that high, huh?
well,
Well,
that could be a stretch.
Yeah, it's not something to joke about, but it's true. In other words, if you try to stand back and say, either you learn to live at peace with your neighbors, extending that word neighbor to mean nearby planets on nearby stars, or you're going to get destroyed. And
Yeah.
their first goal of any planetary government has to be to protect yourself. That means you don't want to be
And
surprised by idiots from Earth. You know?
well, we've had as a nation. You know, I say this often. We've had less than 2 decades in our history of no conflict, where and we go from one enemy to the next. We've always either created an enemy or have a perceived enemy, and unfortunately, we seem to enjoy war a whole lot. Stan, it's at the bottom of the hour, and I'd like to give you the opportunity to kind of tell people your website and where they can get your books and so forth. Yeah.
Well, the easiest way is to go to my website, www.stantonfriedman, that's FRIEDMAN.com. And it lists my future events when you can come hear me talk, and it lists all my books. And I autograph everything I send out and some DVDs as well. My books include Flying Saucers and Science, which looks at all aspects of the phenomena, and you can get here from there, and governments can cover up and stuff like that. One is Captured that you mentioned, that Kathleen Marden, Betty Hill's niece, did most of the work on. Another we did together was Science Was Wrong. 14 chapters. We each did 7. Each one stimulated by some very smart guy saying something stupid, like man will never fly in an airplane any distance, and space travel is utter bilge, said the British Astronomer Royal 1 year before Sputnik went up. Many medical stories. And you may remember Billy Mitchell said airplanes would be very important in future wars. This is after fighting in the First World War. He was court-martialed. And there's an interesting sideline there. The end of November 1941, the Army-Navy football game, big event, bigger than it is now, as a matter of fact. And in the program for the game, it had a picture of the USS Arizona and a battleship, huge battleship, and it said nobody had ever sunk a ship from the sky. 8 days later was Pearl Harbor. 1,100 men went down with that ship. The Japanese knew you could sink a ship from the sky. And so our failure to be concerned about that left, Pearl Harbor undefended, so to speak, and so forth. But there are many examples of well-educated people. There were people who were against vaccination, and, there's a whole long list of these things. And
right.
one of my mantras is progress comes from doing things differently in an unpredictable way. And, that may sound a little weird, but when you stop to think about it, a computer, little pocket calculator, the first ones ran a couple $100, you may remember.
Yep. Yep.
It is not just a small slide rule. And I hope some people listening know what a slide rule is. I was using one. Nobel Prize winners used them back in the 40s. In every direction you look, we have to be ready for the new and different. And don't falsely compare the first model of the new device with the last model of the old one. That's had a lot of money spent on it. The first one usually you barely get by, So what I'm saying is, don't talk about chemical rockets. And also, there are other things on the website, articles to look at, some of them showing what's wrong with SETI. Another book is Crash at Corona, the definitive story of the Roswell incident, which goes back a few years. And also there's my book, Top Secret Magic, MAJIC. Most important classified documents ever leaked to the public way back in 1984, which tell the story that President Truman authorized in 1947, a few months after Roswell, the establishment of a group called Operation Majestic 12, which was to look at this whole situation. And that document says that a saucer crashed at Roswell and there were bodies on board, and named a group of 12, 12 disciples. Easter's coming up, 12 Supreme Court justices, the magic number 12, if you will.
The magic 12, yes.
MAJIC 12, of course. And I have done an awful lot of research as reported in Top Secret Magic. There are 3 good documents. There's 100 lousy ones. I don't care about the lousy ones,
Yeah.
But so it's an exciting world out there. I also have several DVDs, Recollections of Roswell, testimony from 26 firsthand witnesses, all of whom are now dead, incidentally. Not surprising. Roswell was a long time ago.
Yeah, you have had the opportunity. You didn't sit back and just read books. You've been to Roswell. You went, I guess, to people's homes and interviewed them, got to know them.
And 20 archives as well.
Yeah. So and what makes you unique in this world of ufology is you're a scientist. And you really examine things. I like the way your mind works, the way you question, and the way you reason on all this. In my opinion, it makes you stand out. You find the world of ufology to be kind of haphazard, that if it were more of a united effort, that maybe we could get somewhere?
Well, I think so. And I'm looking forward to the future, because something that's changed enormously is that now we recognize that there are probably in the galaxy alone perhaps at least 1 billion planets. It wasn't too many years ago that Dr. Frank Drake said that there might be as many as 8,000 in the galaxy. We used to think we were unique. Some people said this was the only solar system, and therefore we're the only planet with intelligent life on it, and therefore we're top of the heap. And I find very few people saying that anymore. We begin to recognize, well, we got some learning to do yet. So folks, be patient. Give us time.
Yeah, well, that's what got Galileo in trouble with the Catholic Church, is he suggested that the Earth was not the center and that the sun did not revolve around the Earth. And it took,
even though everybody knew that was true, of course.
Yeah. Nobody would admit it because the church had a lot of power.
Yeah, well, it took them 300 years before they decided that, well, maybe Galileo was right after all.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's hope it don't take that long. It's, I've had experiences. There's several things I want to ask you and talk to you about as we go along here. You've got, you got a very lengthy career, and it's kind of hard to hit in 2 hours everything. But there's one question I do want to ask you, and that is that former Canadian Minister of Defense, Paul Hellyer. What
Yes.
do you think of him?
Well, as a matter of fact, I will be seeing him and speaking on the same platform on April the 11th in Toronto. As a modern knowledge tour. I was there in Toronto also when he gave his first talk. And he's even older than I am. He's in darn good shape for a guy our age. And he has had courage enough to speak out. Now, he hasn't done as much investigation as I have, and I had to let him know that one of the books he was counting on for giving him the whole truth had a few holes in it. Let's put it that way to be polite. So, but Paul has had courage to speak out. He's saying the planet is being visited. He is also concerned about a planetary outlook, wanting people to recognize that maybe there are people manipulating the financial affairs of the planet in the background without our best interests at heart. But it's hard to find too many instances of governments really having the public's, gee, I shouldn't say this, should I? Really having the public's best interests at heart. But, it is kind of rare if you look around the planet. And I admire Paul's courage, and I'll be interested to see what he says. That's what, 10 days from now, 11 days from now.
Okay. So you find him credible?
Yeah, I don't agree with everything he has said, but as an
Okay.
individual, yes, he's a courageous man who has the courage of his convictions, and he was the Minister of Defense of Canada way back in the 60s, just as I was a nuclear physicist way back in the 60s and 70s. So yeah, he's the highest ranking official, I suppose, that has spoken out. Although I did locate a general who was involved in the Roswell incident. Most everybody else was dead at the time, but I found him, Dubose, Thomas Jefferson Dubose, and he was in General Ramey's office that I mentioned before, and he told me firsthand, standing 3 feet away from me, that he took the call from General Ramey's boss after this press release went out about Roswell, and he was told, get the press off our back, I don't care how you do it, send some of that wreckage up here today. He was in Washington, Dubose was in Fort Worth, Texas, and I don't want you ever to talk about it again, not even with your buddy Roger Ramey. That's an order. Do I need to put it in writing? Two-star general tells somebody who is a colonel to do something, he does it. Both West Point.
He does it. What? How many times did they change the story about Roswell to the public?
Well, it's at least 4. The first was they said a flying saucer. Roswell flying saucer recovered at Ranch in New Mexico. Then they said, oh, sorry, it was just a radar reflector weather balloon combination. And then they came along with the crash test dummies explanation, which is and interesting. It is true that experiments were done dropping crash test dummies out of airplanes, because when a plane is at 40,000 feet and an engine or a wing gets shot off or something and you want to exit the airplane in a hurry, bail out, you want it to happen automatically, but you also want to know how long before you open the parachute and all this kind of stuff. So they ran a lot of tests. You don't put pilots in those ejection seats until you're sure they work. And so they did run those tests. The only trouble is, and I talked to the man who was in charge of the program, Colonel Madsen, met with him in person, and he stressed to me 2 important things. One was that for the test to be meaningful, the pilots had to be the same size and height and weight The dummies did. They were made out of wood, incidentally. And sometimes an arm would come off when they hit the ground. They were 6 feet tall, 175 pounds. And the other thing that was important was none of them were dropped until 6 years after Roswell. So we got time travel for crash test dummies. You know, this is rather absurd, but they put out a big fat report after they said they weren't going to say anything more. I left out an important explanation. Project Mogul. Oh my goodness. This was a project. We knew that sometime the Russians would be testing their first atomic bomb. And so we conducted Project Mogul. It was not a huge balloon. It was a string of 20 or so, 20 up to 24 standard neoprene weather balloons that you buy in a surplus store. You know, bases were launching every day. A string of 20 of these or so attached with twine, one to the next. And you launched them, and you had ballast, so you tried to keep them at a constant altitude as they would move 1,000 miles. And while they're up there, they're listening for signals from an atomic bomb test from someplace, the Soviet Union. And so the idea was fairly straightforward. It didn't work very well, as it happens, but the Air Force said, we figured out why people thought there were, saucers. They were Mogul test balloons. Well, and it turns out there's no launch that fits the time frame. And when they're out in the sun in New Mexico in the summertime, the plastic goes to heck in a hurry. Neoprene is not that strong. And so that was the other explanation in there. And it sounded great. Oh, it was highly classified, but it wasn't highly classified. The purpose was, you didn't see any articles in the paper talking about trying to see if the Russians were going to test any nuclear weapons. So that part was classified. But the balloons were not. None of the technology was exotic, elaborate, expensive, or anything like that. It didn't work terribly well, but at least, it was an honest effort. And look, I'm the last guy to say you should only try things you can be sure about. I worked on more canceled government-sponsored research and development programs than anybody did. Look, I was working, to give you an illustration, I worked on aircraft nuclear propulsion systems for General Electric Aircraft Nuclear Propulsion Department back between 1956 and 59. This was not a small program. We spent $100 million in 1958. That was a lot of money back then. We employed 3,500 people full-time, of whom 1,100 were engineers and scientists. And we never flew a nuclear-powered aircraft. We ran a lot of interesting experiments. I enjoyed the effort, but $100 million. And I mention this because I find that the academics seem to think that all research gets done in academia. Not so. With 6 professors and 20 grad students would be a big program. We had 3,500 people. And they certainly don't have $100 million for their little experimental programs, which we did. So it illustrates the Cold War. If I get people telling me, do you think all our new technology came from study of the Roswell wreckage? No, I don't. I think it came, most of it. I'm not saying we didn't learn anything from Roswell. That's a different question. But most new technology has come about as a result of spending a ton of money. A lot of smart people out there in the national laboratories, in industry. Lockheed spent $10 billion to develop the stealth airplane. That's not peanuts. Billion, that was, not million.
It is. Betty and Barney Hill.
Yes.
I've seen and read a lot about that. And the one thing that all these cases have as a common denominator, you have a lot of debunkers, a lot of skeptics. And as you say, none of these skeptics have dug as deep as you have and spent the time researching it like you have. Tell the story and why you give it credence.
Well, okay. First of all, I did meet. This happened in 1961 in New Hampshire. Betty and Barney had gone over to Toronto, kind of a delayed honeymoon, second marriage for both of them. They were driving back through Montreal and then turned and headed south. They lived in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And it was in the evening, not much traffic, September 1961. And Betty spots a light in the sky, and she watches it, and Barney isn't very interested. He's driving. And then she said a UFO, and he said, there are no such things, Betty. And then they watched it come a lot closer, and they saw it in front of the Old Man of the Mountain, which was, until it collapsed into a lake, a natural formation in New Hampshire, which is 48 feet high. And they said it was about 1.5 times the size of the Man in the Mountain, which would make it about 72 feet. Now, the debunkers have said, it was Jupiter. And Jupiter doesn't fly around much the last time I checked. and certainly doesn't sit in front of a sculptured mountain, if you will. But then it came a lot closer. And Barney stopped the car and he got out with his binoculars to look at this thing just a couple hundred feet away. And there's a double row of windows, and red lights came out on each side. And he got very frightened because he saw beings inside the double row of windows. And he dashes back to the car and says something to Betty about they're going to capture us. Takes off. And then there's a vague period of time in which they heard some strange noises shaking the car. And they drove on. Barney, for some reason, went off the main road to a secondary road and then to a tertiary road, which makes no sense. And there's beings in the road and a craft. And they stopped, and they were taken out of the car by these beings, humanoids, I'll call them. It was not octopuses or anything like that, or octopi, whatever. And they were taken on board into separate rooms, were physically examined, take skin samples here, hair samples there, and so forth, put back out, told they wouldn't remember what happened, and didn't until a couple of years later. I mean, they go back to their car, and they're taken back to their car, and they go on home, and they suddenly realize that both their watches had stopped, and they got home 2 hours later than they had expected to get home. This is in the middle of the night in New Hampshire. There's no traffic. It's not a question of running into too much traffic. And they didn't know what happened. And they both developed physical symptoms. Betty had dreams of abductions 5 nights in a row a couple of weeks later. Barney developed an ulcer. And finally, Barney's doctor said, Barney, I've done all I can for you. I think you ought to see a psychiatrist. Because, it was strongly believed that ulcers were a result of stress. And the best part of the story is they wound up with Dr. Benjamin Simon, a psychiatrist, Harvard trained, and he was the world-class expert on what we today call post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. But he, at that time, shell-shock war veterans had come back from World War II. And he ran a hospital with 3,000 beds for such vets. And he worked out a protocol using medical hypnosis to help these guys get back into being normal. Your buddy's head gets blown off next to you in battle. That's a pretty hard thing to integrate. Why him and not me, and so forth, and gory. And the Army even made a movie, Let There Be Light, starring Dr. Simon, as he showed how he would get these veterans back to being okay. So he did 10 sessions each over a several month period, of course, not together, induced amnesia after each session as they relived this experience. And the story that came out from both of them was that they'd been taken on board, examined, treated as specimens, if you will, catch and release program, I call it. And it was an extraordinary story, and they were never going to go public with it, but they gave a little talk to a group, and somebody taped it, unknown to them. And they get a call from a reporter from Boston paper wanting to interview them about what? About your experience with the UFO. What? They wanted no part of it. And they went to a lawyer, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Anyway, he published an article, and much to everybody's surprise, I mean, they thought they'd lose their job. Betty was a social worker. Barney worked for the post office, but was very active in civil rights. Betty was white, Barney was black. It was a little unusual in New Hampshire in the 60s, as you can imagine. And he worked with guys out at the base, Pease Air Force Base, on civil rights. He was he was appointed to the Governor's Civil Rights Commission, as a matter of fact. And so the reception was so good when this story went all over that a man named John Fuller, who was working on a book about Exeter, New Hampshire, 50th anniversary coming up in September, and I'll be speaking there. A very good case involving police officers and local people and so forth. And Fuller heard about the Hill experience from the article in the paper, met with them, and they agreed that he could write a book about it. And he did, The Interrupted Journey. And it got extraordinarily good responses around the world. There was even a television program years later starring James Earl Jones as Barney. As a matter of fact, Estelle Parsons as Betty. I was a consultant on that. I happened to be living in California and so forth. And there's a part I haven't mentioned. Betty, under hypnosis, relives how she's trying to get the leader to tell her where he's from. She says, "I know you're not from around here," the understatement of the month. And he shows her, I'll describe it as a star map, really a three-dimensional map, little points of light that were supposedly standing for stars, and lines, different dashed lines, solid lines between the stars, trade routes and occasional expeditions and so forth. And she's looking at this thing. It's about 3 feet by 2 feet by 3 feet. And she's looking up at it, Betty is sure. And she says, "Well, where are you on the map?" And wise guy alien says, "Do you know where you are?" "No, I don't know anything about astronomy." "Well, how can I tell you where I'm from if you don't know where you're at?" End of discussion. You know? Well, Dr. Simon, who didn't know anything about UFOs, but he sure knew a lot about people, asked her if she could remember what it looks like. She says, "Yes, that star map." And he gives her a post-hypnotic suggestion. If and only if she can remember it accurately, please draw it later on. So she goes home and she draws it and she brings it in, and it's in the book, The Interrupted Journey. And the only trouble is, which stars are which? What does this mean, if anything? Well, that was up in the air until a brilliant woman named Marjorie Fish did something nobody else had ever done. She built a total of more, I guess it was 25, three-dimensional models of our local galactic neighborhood, believe it or not. Little beads standing for stars, hung on fish line. And she had to get permission from the head of the astronomy department at Ohio State University. She was a teacher. To look at the star catalogs. She had to copy out by hand all the coordinates of the stars. To make a long story short, she was looking for a three-dimensional pattern that matched the two-dimensional one that Betty had drawn. And she finally found one and only one pattern after eliminating a lot of stars because the astronomer said, "Oh, those won't have planets," and so forth. And she found one pattern that matched. Every one of the stars in the pattern were sun-like stars. And the base stars turned out to be Zeta 1 and Zeta 2. That's the Greek letter. Reticuli. That's the constellation of Reticulum. That means the net in Latin. I don't speak Latin, but somebody told me that's what it means. And they're 39.3 light years away. And the two stars are about an eighth of a light year apart. That means they're 30 times closer to each other than the sun is to the next star over. We're out in the boondocks. I don't mean Fredericton now. I mean our solar system. And these guys had next door neighbors. From a planet around one looking over at the other, it's visible all day long. Now, you'd certainly have a lot more incentive. Oh, maybe a billion years older than the sun. You'd have a lot more incentive to go interstellar to develop a system for traveling interstellar when you got a next door neighbor. So it's an exciting piece of work. I was the first to publish about it. And Astronomy Magazine picked up on the subject after I suggested it to the editor, and they ran an article. It got more response than anything they'd ever published. Got all kinds of letters from debunkers as well as supporters. And they put together, after a year of carrying one letter per issue, they put together a special collection of all these letters in the original article and stuff. Sold 10,000 copies in no time, which is unheard of for this kind of thing. And then Carl Sagan, whose name was on the front, along with several of the other people who'd written letters, threatened to sue them, his lawyer did. And they made me an offer I couldn't refuse because I had suggested the original article. I wound up with 18,000 copies of this 32-page booklet, full color, and moved many of them from California, where I was living, to New Brunswick here. And I don't have a one. I haven't had for many years. It was a big hit. If I had another 10,000 copies, I'm sure I could sell them too. But it gives us some insight. Marjorie was not a scientist. She was a teacher. She belonged to Mensa. And she was dubious to begin with because what she knew about biology, she couldn't imagine that anybody would look anything like us, that is humanoid, 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, body. It may be in New York City they'd pass as Earthlings, but not many other places. Enough different to say, hey, what's going on here? But it's an exciting story. And Kathleen Marden spent a lot of time with Aunt Betty's. She transcribed all the tapes. All these hypnosis sessions were taped. She transcribed all those. She cross-compared what Betty said with what Barney said in the same situation. In other words, how did you get out of the car? Both of their descriptions matched. So many aliens on this side, so many on the other side, took us up a ramp and so forth and so on. And so I was very fortunate to meet Betty and Barney back in 1968, if you can believe it. Something very unusual happened. I'd done what got me started as a speaker and so forth was a radio program called, of all things, Contact on KDKA Pittsburgh, which is one of the old 50,000 watt clear channel stations, radio and television. And I was on a show there, and somebody heard me at work and asked me to give a lecture in their living room, and it was from right on there. And they called me, the station called me, because I had done this show several times, to tell me that Betty and Barney were coming to town. And because they trusted me, they told me where Betty and Barney were staying, which is very unusual, as I'm sure you're aware. And I called them. We had dinner together. So I had a chance. Barney died less than 6 months later. And I've been at Betty's home, been at Betty's house a number of times since. They're both deceased. Not surprising by this time. But it's a great story, and Kathleen did so much work, and I did write a chapter about the star map work, and took care of some of the arguments, the false arguments made by the nasty, noisy negativists, as I call them when I'm being polite. Some of the ancient academics and fossilized physicists who give the story a hard time. Look, there have been at least a dozen PhD theses done about UFOs. I'd like to see at least 2 more. One with why some people are so anti the debunkers. Why don't they look at the evidence? Why is it important to them to debunk when they don't know what they're talking about? Yeah, I'd love to see that happen. The will not to believe, in other words. And the other is, I don't know why people make up stories, you know, and some people do. We have to admit it.
I went most of my life without ever seeing anything that I would call an unidentified flying object. And the first time I saw something unusual was again in Canada, the first time. And
We have clear skies up here.
it feels like you can reach up and grab a star out of the sky up there. And I was in my RV at a KOA campground and laying in my bed, and I had the curtains and the window open, just gazing, at the stars, trying to drift off to sleep. And all of a sudden, there's a light that is moving across the sky, and it hit the point and disappears, just vanished. It was a very clear night, no clouds or anything. And I looked and I thought, well, that's strange. It wasn't like it burned out or anything. It was just disappeared. And then within a few seconds of that, another light comes from a totally different direction. And reaches the same point, and it too vanished when it reached that same point in the sky. Never reappeared. And of course, I understand there's no satellites that are rotating the sky up there. So no. But that was my first experience. One other, if you don't mind, Stan, me sharing this with you.
I would like to hear it.
In Northeast Alabama, I had a little place up in the woods in the mountains. And one night, I got woke up from my sleep with a loud banging on the door. And I'll abbreviate this story. The bottom line is that eventually there were a group of several of these vehicles that looked like government vehicles, and a bunch of guys in suits. And I opened my door and walked out on the deck. And the next thing I know, I'm face down. Well, right before I went face down, I noticed coming over the roof of my deck a huge, huge oval, not round, not cigar shaped, but an oval craft that was so huge that two of these military helicopters flying around it looked like toys. And it was moving just real slow, like floating across the sky, no sound from it. And immediately I was thrown down, face down on the deck, a knee pressed in my back, and I felt something sharp going to my neck. And the next thing I know, I'm waking up in my bed hours later, grabbing my neck, still feeling the pain.
Wow.
So I have no memory except for that. So,
did they give you an explanation?
No explanation, no words exchanged. I had weird hours, and the only thing I could conclude is they were concerned that as they were transporting something or escorting something, that they were afraid that I might be awake to see it. I don't know. It was very strange.
Wow. Well, I hate to tell you this, but I've never seen one. And as I point, people say, "You mean you talk about these things and you haven't seen one?" I said, "Look, I spent 14 years chasing neutrons and gamma rays. Never saw one. They're real too."
Yeah. I saw one other one subsequent to that, but I'd gone through all those years, and I was one of these real crazy guys that would stand in a field and look up at the sky and say, "Beam me up." I wanted to see one, and it just never happened until later in life. And then these occurrences happened, not close together, but I did have those couple of experiences. So that leads me to the next question of what about these men in black you hear about?
Well, interesting question, because I don't know what to make of them. I had what some people would call a Men in Black experience. I was at a conference in Oklahoma, and I got a call where I was staying. I was staying at the host's house. Could they take me to lunch the next day? because there was a 2-day conference, and I spoke on Saturday, and I'd be speaking again on Sunday. Sure, why not? Told them where I was. Okay, so the next day, up drives a big black Cadillac. There are 3 guys in it, in black suits, well dressed. We went out to lunch, had a lovely lunch, and they take me back to the house. And I once told somebody the story, and the next thing I hear, some tabloid says Friedman had a Man in Black experience. And I didn't think of it that way. There was certainly no threatening, no nothing, no. But I have talked to some people who apparently were visited by somebody intent on convincing them not to talk anymore about what they had seen. Now, who knows what that means? Had they seen something of ours that was a secret system? And we certainly have worked on secret systems. Who knows? But I haven't heard many Men in Black stories recently. I don't know what that means.
So in all your investigation, all your work, like you say, you've never had that privilege, if you will, to personally see a UFO, but you clearly find enough evidence and stories to believe they're there.
Yeah, 4 major conclusions. And one is the evidence is overwhelming the planet's being visited by intelligently controlled extraterrestrials. 2, there's no question we're dealing with a cosmic Watergate. That means some few people in government know what's going on. You don't keep secrets by telling everybody. You have a strong need to know component to secrecy. Not only do you need a clearance that's appropriate, but you need a need to know for that particular information. The 3rd conclusion is there are no good arguments against the first 2. And the 4th is we're dealing with the biggest story of the millennium. Visits to planet Earth by alien spacecraft, successful cover-up of the best data, bodies, and wreckage by the government. So I don't play games. I don't think that, maybe, or I don't say that maybe it's possible that perhaps we could be visited. I say we are being visited. And there is a cosmic Watergate. And, it surprises some people. I've given over 700 lectures. I've had 11 hecklers, and 2 of them were drunk.
Okay. It is, there's a lot of history. You go back and they find depictions on and drawings and caves and so forth. Do you feel that there's been visitations over thousands of years?
Yes. As a matter of fact, the book that I recommend to people is by Dr. Barry Downing, who was a minister in New York. He had a bachelor's in physics and a doctor of divinity. Divine physics is Barry's beat. And he goes through both the Old and the New Testament, picking out stories that seem to reflect observations of what we would today call flying saucers. I mean, they didn't use saucers back then, but they didn't use that term at all. But the pillar of fire by night, the cloud by day, Ezekiel's wheel, and there's a whole bunch of these stories. And you look, I heard a talk once given by 2 professors, a husband and wife team from the University of Delaware, and they were talking about 11 different old civilizations, like the Mayans and people like that, all had stories of craft coming down from the sky with beings on board, not angels. They didn't put a religious thing on, but it was a craft, and there were beings. And 11 is kind of a large number of old civilizations, and all these stories were from before the modern UFO era, if you will. So there's a tradition about it. And, there are a lot of stories, there are a lot of things that it took a lot of doing for us to get to believe. The meteors. Everybody knows rocks can't fall from the sky because there are no rocks in the sky until somebody saw one fall and picked up the pieces and, looked at other pieces and so forth and so on. And now we know meteors do fall from the sky. But there was a long period of time where that was not accepted. It took some courageous people. The same goes in an entirely different area. Parental abuse of children. Until maybe 50 years ago, nobody would believe, doctors wouldn't believe that happened.
Mhm.
Well, the kid fell down the stair or ran into a door or, all kinds of arguments. Then some very courageous guys took a survey and talked to people at hospitals, and they found lots of examples. And now most states have rules you have to report incidents if a teacher sees a kid who, was damaged for no good reason. You have to report it, and it's cut down on the number of mysterious injuries to children. Even though at first it'd been going on for a long time, people didn't want to believe it. And so, what can you say? There are mysterious things in the world, but we need to look at them.
We have a lot yet to learn.
You're right.
Yes, Albert. Stan, I really respect your opinions and your views on things. You're, as far as I'm concerned, I guess you have the lengthiest career in ufology, and on top of that, again, you're a nuclear physicist. You're a scientist. You've got trained to think like a scientist, and that's the way your brain works. So, Zecharia Sitchin, I'm sure you've heard of him.
Yeah, I've met him.
And what do you think? What's your opinion of his work?
I'm intrigued because Zecharia is really a scientist. I unfortunately I don't speak Sumerian. I can't translate it or anything like that, so I have no way to check on his translation of these cuneiform tablets and all that sort of stuff. But I was very impressed with the way he went about things, and I think he may very well have been right. And there's an interesting sidelight. He said the guys came here to mine gold, basically. Well, one of the peculiar things about planet Earth, aside from the people on the surface and the fact that it's covered with water, 3/4 compared to the rest of the planets, which you don't have visible water lying around, one of the peculiar things is the Earth is the densest planet in the solar system. In other words, if you take the whole weight and size of the Earth and compare it to all the other planets, a cubic foot of Earth weighs more than a cubic foot of any other planet. And you might say, so what? Well, that means there are more heavy metals here. And heavy metals are rare in the universe because we can look at the spectra of a star. We study the light that comes from a star and bend it with a prism and so forth. And we know heavy metals are rare. When I say heavy, I don't mean lead. I mean things like osmium and rhenium and gold. On a scale where lead has a density of 11 grams per cubic centimeter, gold is 19. Osmium is 22. Twice as heavy a cubic inch of osmium is than lead. And gold is a rather special element. Look, gold ore is worth mining if you get ½ ounce per ton of ore. So it isn't as far out as it might seem. I've had a lot of people tell me, I thought all the planets were alike. Well, they're not alike. Saturn is so light, if you had a big enough bucket of water, you could float Saturn on it. That's a little hard to imagine. But so the idea that they're here to get gold, which is basically what Zecharia was talking about, is not nearly as weird as you might think it is. And, we sometimes forget how ignorant we were, still are. But what I was getting at was, what uranium was used for 100 years ago? As a yellow coloring agent for tableware. That's illegal now because it's radioactive, but I mean, uranium is dense, just about the same density as gold. So rare elements that have special properties. How's that? Is a nice way of putting it. We may not. Well, another two that you might be interested in are zirconium and titanium, two other elements. Not because they're heavy, but because they have special properties. And the nuclear navy is entirely dependent on alloys of zirconium. They had to develop a whole new technology to be able to not only mine it, but draw it into tubing and plate and all that sort of stuff. And titanium, high strength, higher melting point than, say, iron, and use it in the SR 71 airplane. More expensive, but it's got special characteristics. So who knows what we have here that they may not have been or may have been mining all this time, like under the water. There are over 1,000 reports that we know about craft of some kind coming into and out of the seawater. And that sounds weird until you realize the bottom of the ocean is covered with nodules of all kinds of things, cobalt, manganese, stuff like that. Off the coast of Africa, diamonds. You know, I hear people say, well, nobody would come here to get anything. Well, you know that there are some biological materials that are worth a lot more than gold per ounce?
Yeah.
You know, so we need to reconsider some of our notions about why people do things. You know, and that's a question I get asked a lot. Why would aliens come here anyway? Why don't they land on the White House lawn? Well, it's a no-fly zone for one thing. They were observed over Washington in great numbers in 1952 and chased by airplanes and so forth.
Yeah.
But I hate to tell people, but especially Americans, and I'm American and Canadian, I hate to tell people that the President of the United States doesn't speak for 7 billion Earthlings. Sometimes he doesn't speak for 310 million Americans. So who speaks for planet Earth? And I can't imagine the Galactic Federation extending an invitation to join to an individual country any more than the Senate lets people represent cities. You know, the standard unit would be a planet. You'd think the people on a planet would learn to get along with each other. We don't do a very good job of it, but and you know, I can just see graduate students coming here studying the planet. How come there's so many languages on this planet? You know, there are a lot of other things you can think about, but what I'm trying to say is we need to step back and look at this problem objectively. What's going on? What do the observations represent? And people are very surprised when I point out, when I ask my audiences at the end of my lecture, I get the first question: how many people here believe they've seen what I would consider to be a flying saucer? I've defined my terms earlier, and some people get mad at me. Why do you say flying saucer? Why don't you say UFO? Because all flying saucers are UFOs. Only a few UFOs are flying saucers. And I'm interested in flying saucers, not UFOs. It's kind of like all great-grandfathers, by definition, are men. But not all men are great-grandfathers.
Right.
I happen to be one. So not all UFOs are alien spacecraft. It's the ones that are that I'm concerned about, and I'm going to call them flying saucers, whether they like it or not. There's a lot we have to learn. And when I ask my audiences that question, how many believe they've seen one, the hands go up tentatively. I said, you know, I'm just going to point and count, and by this time they've heard my lecture, so they've been conned already, you know. And the hands go up slowly, and I point and count. By the time I get across the hall, pointing and counting, it's 10% of the audience. And the last hands go up vigorously. Each one thought he was the only one. But then I ask, how many of you reported what you saw? 90% of the hands go down. When people come to my table for me to sign their books, stuff like that, they got to tell me their sighting. And I'll say, did you report it? No. Why not? They'd think I was some kind of a nut. That's the standard response, even though the opinion polls show that there are more believers than non-believers.
Right.
But everybody thinks everybody else doesn't believe, so they're very cautious about what they want to say.
Yeah. They still have that stigma attached to it.
That's right.
So
It's really strange. Everywhere I've gone, and I've spoken in 18 countries and 50 states and 10 provinces, and there are sightings everywhere. And yet I get people saying, how come I haven't heard about any sightings the last few months? MUFON, Mutual UFO Network, the largest respectable UFO group in the country, gets about 700 sighting reports a month. A month.
that's only a small percentage.
Yeah, that's only a small portion of it. And Their address is at my website, www.stantonfriedman.com, just so you can find out how to reach them. And it's got my email address as well. And I'm visible. I don't give out my number on the air, though, because then I'd be swamped. So they can read it if they want.
Well, so there's no doubt that you, as you stated, you make it very clear, you believe we're being visited.
Yes.
The question I've got, and I believe that I understand it correctly, but correct me if I'm wrong. You believe that not so much the government knows as some in the government have information regarding this.
Yeah, there's a reason for that. I had a security clearance for 14 years. For example, I worked on radiation shielding for nuclear airplanes. And I was reading classified nuclear science abstracts and ran across some reports from the Navy about radiation shielding for submarine reactors. And so I tried to get them. I wasn't allowed to. I didn't have a need to know. I had the right clearance, the Q clearance for nuclear stuff, but the Navy people wouldn't give me any opportunity to see that information. So the need to know is very important. And it's one of the best protections for classified material, because there are some people in Washington who think they're so important that if this were true, they would know about it, and they don't, so there must not be. Of course, there's some media people like that, too. I've done programs with people who said, look, I read the New York Times. I don't see anything in there that convinces me these things are real. The attitude being that I keep track of what's important in this world, and if this were true, it would be important. But if it were important, I would know about it, and I don't, so it must not be true, and let's forget about it. I'm not going to waste my time on it. That's an attitude I've run across. I just read a book, as a matter.
Journalists and newspapers are afraid that they'll lose their credibility if they reported it in any other fashion.
Well, yeah, they're getting better, and I must say that I've had plenty of coverage, and it's not 100% accurate most of the time, but I can only remember one article where they were unpleasant. And I get good, like I said, I've only had 11 hecklers, and 2 of them were drunk, so, you know, you can't convince everybody of anything, I think. You know, the moon is made of green cheese, didn't you know that?
That's what I read back in the late 50s. Yes.
Well, yeah, and so people are surprised that I don't get a hard time from my audiences. But well, I'll give you a specific example. A guy gets up in the question and answer period, well dressed, spoke well, great start. He says, "I've never heard so much nonsense in one night in my life." You know, great way to start. Fortunately, I had the good sense to say, "Can you be a bit more specific, please?" You said that Betty and Barney Hill were taken to Zeta Reticuli and back in 2 hours. I said, "No, sir. What I said was they were taken on board a craft. They didn't go anywhere." He had another you said, equally ridiculous, and a third, and then somebody in the audience said, "How about taking some sensible questions?" This guy got up and walked out. So I said, "Look, I'll take your question, but who was that?" Obviously, I had gotten him angry. He was a professor of physics. He hadn't heard what I said. You know, what can I tell you?
Yeah.
And I do play some games. When I'm on campuses, I frequently do a little seminar in the afternoon, you know, before the evening lecture. And I'll ask them about, I'll go to the blackboard and talk about the electromagnetic submarine. And you're all familiar with that. Of course, nobody is. And I talk about the nuclear rocket engines. And these are things I pretty well know that they don't know anything about. Then I get down to brass tacks. What's the numerical value of 1 G? You talk about pilots having to stand so many G's, you know, and stuff. 9.8 meters per second squared. Well, that's right. But I said, how does that relate to a Corvette? And they look at me like I'm talking Swahili. 1 G is 21 miles per hour per second. So if a car is being accelerated at 1 G, at the end of 3 seconds, it's going 63 miles an hour. That's a pretty hot car, because most cars take 4, 5, 6 seconds to get to 60. And then I'll say, what's the speed of light? 300,000 kilometers per second. I say, again, we don't talk about anything else with those units. That's 670 million miles an hour. Then the question that I ask is, so how long does it take? It's a multiple choice question. How long does it take at 1G to get to the speed of light? Now, everybody knows that the fastest you can go is the speed of light. Okay. And I say it's a multiple choice question. 1,000 years, 100 years, 10, or 1. How many think it's 1,000? A bunch of hands go up. Then a bunch for 110, and a few for 1. The right answer is 1 year at 1G to get to the speed of light. And here I'm talking to professors and usually grad students in physics and stuff. And the real world hasn't been introduced as far as they're concerned. So, and also they want a half an Einstein. That may sound funny, but not only did Einstein say that the speed of light is a limit, but he also said, well, two other strange things. One, when light goes by a star, it gets bent. That didn't make any sense to some people. It did theoretically to him, but anyway, there's a big eclipse expedition where they could measure the position of stars as the light from the star went by the sun and the moon. And Einstein was right. And the amount it was bent was right. Now, the other thing he said, and this is even crazier, was as you get close to the speed of light, time slows down for things moving that fast. And, you know, that's the way the world was constructed. Don't ask me why that is. Well, what that means is as you get close to the speed of light, let's say 99.9% of the speed of light, you can go 37 light years in 6 months, pilot time. You go out, come back, marry your granddaughter's best friend. And the big accelerator over in CERN there in Switzerland on the border, Large Hadron Collider, the particles are accelerated to 99.9999% of the speed of light. So this is not an unheard of territory. And believe it or not, Mother Nature makes cosmic rays that go that fast too. So the speed of light is not quite the obstacle that some people think it is. Now, it takes a certain amount of energy, but that's why I mentioned nuclear fusion, because the fusion reactions that produce the energy in the sun and all the other stars produce charged particles that have an enormous amount of energy, 10 million times as much energy per particle. You don't need to accelerate them to that speed. They're born that way. Look, I realize that sounds crazy to people. What do you mean? Well, the fusion reaction produces an enormous amount of energy per reaction. At some units, normal chemical reactions, lighting a match, burning gasoline, or anything like that, a few electron volts, it's a measure of energy per reaction. Nuclear fusion reactions, 18 million electron volts per reaction. So it's a whole other ball game, and we're not accustomed to dealing with things that vary that much. But that's the way the universe is. Sorry.
Yeah. So as you said, with the knowledge you have at this moment, you're suggesting then that any space travel, that aliens visiting the planet, that they would be able to cover these distances because they're using nuclear fusion.
Or something better, but that's something that every advanced civilization, and I'm not saying we're an advanced civilization, but every advanced civilization will know about nuclear fusion, and it's the obvious thing to use. But remember, progress comes from doing things differently. And look, one of the craziest things about the world in which we live, when you go from a big fat atom down to a tiny nucleus inside it, you go down in size by maybe 10,000 times, and you go up in energy by 10 million. Now that sounds weird as heck. You know, you get smaller in size, it should go down in energy. But that's not the way God created the universe, if you want to look at it that way. And so we may find other ways of producing more energy than fusion. All I know is Mother Nature uses it all the time and all those stars out there. So it's not the impossible dream.
Do you think, or do you have any reason to believe or speculate that as we extend out in the universe, that the laws of physics changes.
Well, I don't think we've seen enough of the universe to know that they seem to be the same all over. When we look at stars and the light from them, even in other galaxies, the things that seem to be going on are the same. I'm not saying we're not going to discover new physics, because that's the way it's been. We do discover new physics. And I don't think we've reached the end of that road yet, not with such a short time of investigation behind us. But I think we will discover some new aspects of physics that we had no idea were there. And that would surprise me if we didn't. Our egos get in the way. Look, there were people, astronomers in the 19th century that said that we'll never know the composition of the stars. It was before the end of the 19th century that we learned how to find out about the composition of the stars. That sounds weird, but that's the way it is. So there are smart people, there are young people today who will probably make really shocking discoveries. I mean, if you go back to 1890, we didn't know about that there were neutrons or gamma rays or X-rays or fission or fusion or DNA. An awful lot of stuff we didn't know. And I'm sure there's more.
When we look out into the universe, first of all, my understanding is that there's seemingly, of course, no end to it. So we have only looked a short distance in reality.
Well, we can look a long distance. We don't go a long distance. In other words, we know that it extends out at least 13 billion light years. How's that? Our galaxy, the Milky Way, is only 100,000 light years across. So 13 billion is a long way.
Yeah, but because of distance, even given the speed of light, the further out we look, we're looking back in time, aren't we?
Yes, of course.
So what we're seeing, I guess even with our naked eye, a lot of what we're seeing may be stars or whatever that's non-existent now.
That's conceivable. Yeah, look, it wasn't until the 1920s that we realized there was more than one galaxy.
Mm-hmm.
We're ignorant, as somebody once said.
Well, I can see how a lot of people would suggest that in the last 100 years or so that we've made so much progress and gained the knowledge we have, they would suggest that we had, if you will, alien input into our knowledge base.
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't know, except for certain knowledge that there's life out there, which provides us with some input. The fact that aliens are coming here means there's knowledge that there are aliens out there. That's a big step forward. Copernicus and Galileo and all these guys didn't know about that stuff.
Well, it's so like Sir Isaac Newton coming up with calculus in 6 months.
There was a brilliant man, and there will be more brilliant. Einstein was a brilliant man, and there are others. And there will be more. And that's the thing. That's why I say one of the PhD theses I'd like to see is people trying to figure out why some people set a limit. We know all there is to know. The nasty, noisy negativists, as I call them. There are brilliant people born every now and then. And I know some people will say that's because they're alien hybrids or stuff like that. And I don't see any reason to say that.
I assume you've heard of David Icke and his reptilian theories.
I'm not a booster.
Okay. Now we're down to the last about 20 minutes that we're going to be on here, Stan. Any new, exciting UFO experiences that you know about?
There's an event coming up that is going to be interesting. Let's put it that way. A couple of slides have been found, which some people, the guys who own the slides, are calling the Roswell slides because they show, two slides show, I'll call it a body because I don't know what else to call it. It could be a mummy or a dummy or who knows what. And they're calling them the Roswell slides. And there's going to be a big event. Jaime Maussan, who's a Mexican newsman, actually, and has asked people to let him know about the UFO sighting. So he carries a lot more in Mexico City on the top TV station, a lot more UFO stuff than most guys do. He's putting on a show in a stadium there that holds 10,000 people, I understand. And they're going to talk about the results of their investigation of these slides. And I was asked to go, and I thought about it and tried to find out as much as I could, and I couldn't find any reason to call them Roswell-related slides. Even if the Kodachrome film was made in 47 or so, that doesn't prove that the images on them have anything to do with Roswell. And so I get some people give me a very hard time from backing up from going. And it would have been nice to go to Mexico City when it was, 10 below zero here. But so I don't know what's going to come out of that, but I'm sure there'll be a lot of publicity for it. MUFON is holding its big symposium this year in California. It's listed on my website, www.stantonfriedman.com, and I'll be giving a paper there, How to Make Ufology More Respectable. How's that for a challenging title? And I will be offering, you have to write papers, and they're included in the proceedings of the symposium. And that could be interesting. And I was just looking back at some old ones. I'm looking at a book called Signatures of Life, Science Searches the Universe by Edward Ashpole. And I'm just writing my monthly MUFON Journal article about it because he doesn't do too bad on SETI, but he does a lousy job on UFOs. And who knows? Maybe we'll figure out a good way to be more respectable in ufology by getting people to be more courageous. I think part of that is getting people to recognize that they're not the only ones who think that there's something to this. And also, I hate to tell people this, but governments can keep secrets. That may surprise some people. But
I live and was born and raised here in Alabama, and this is where they conducted the experiment on the African American males down in Tuskegee, Alabama, that did not end until after I graduated from high school. They kept that a secret even from the people they were doing it to.
That's right. Well, let me give you a strange example. President Eisenhower set up a group called Project Solarium, and 3 different teams were to look at different ways of containment of the Soviet Union. They met over a period of time, several times. It was set up in 1953. He became president that year. And there was no public discussion of that until the 1980s. And yet that set American foreign policy for the next 25 years. Can't keep secrets. The atomic bomb project. A lot of money spent, a lot of tens of thousands of people involved. But one of the things they did was they had to find a way to enrich uranium, because you want U-235 and U-238's a pain in the neck. So how do you separate? You got less than 1% to begin with. My goodness, impossible. Well, they set up a gaseous diffusion plant, it was called, up in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And there, because they had a lot of electricity, the plant was a mile long. And they pumped uranium hexafluoride gas through little tiny holes and sheets of nickel. And they pumped them through, and the lighter one, U-235, a little bit lighter than U-238. It goes through a little quicker, and you put it through again and again. The building was a mile long. It used 5% of all the electricity produced in the United States. All of it in secret. And most of the people working on the project had no idea what they were doing. They were told, when the needle shows this on the scale, you turn this dial, and, instructions. But without any clue that it involved uranium or anything else like that, or an atomic bomb, for example. And a lot of people don't realize, incidentally, that within 2 weeks of the start of World War II, an Office of Censorship was established. And the word uranium, incidentally, not too long, was forbidden to be used by the press. So there are a lot of things going on that we don't know about. And, the Washington Post 2 years ago did a story on military intelligence in the United States. And they said the total black budget that is not under direct congressional control was $52.6 billion that year. That's the CIA, mostly the CIA, the NSA, National Security Agency, and the NRO, National Reconnaissance Office. $52.6 billion, all of it secret. And talk about keeping secrets and spending lots of money. That's not your typical graduate student project at a university.
Far
to say
from
the
it.
least. Right.
And the amazing thing to me is what we could do with that money.
Well, yeah, I mean, you realize on this planet of ours, this wonderful planet Earth, it's the only one we got, we will spend collectively $1 trillion this year on things military. $1 trillion. How many kids died of starvation last night?
And lack
Quite
of good drinking water.
Well, yeah, that's one of the major reasons for it. Be nice if some of that trillion were spent to help the people on the planet, wouldn't it?
And we have a very skewed set of priorities. And that, as I told you before, is what concerned me about our space explorations as far as trying to reach out and populate other planets. We just, until we get it right here, what's the point?
Well, we're not doing much populating of other planets at the moment, as far as I can tell. Why don't we go back to the moon?
Well,
the obvious answer is the aliens said, "Stay the heck off our moon, guys."
Well, that's what I have heard, and it is amazing. We made that quick run to the moon, very, very few trips, and then shut it down, and that just kind of blew my mind.
Well, the excuse by President Nixon was, well, we don't have the money. But the Apollo 18 and 19 were built. You pay the Navy whether they're looking for astronauts coming down in the ocean or looking for Soviet submarines. The Navy guys get paid the same. So it sounds a little fishy.
Yeah,
right?
they were in the process. They were in the process of building the space shuttle at that point in time, weren't they?
Well, yeah, they started it, and what have we done? I'll tell you, I worked on the space program, and everybody I knew, along with myself, expected we'd have a base on the moon by the end of the century. Thought we would have taken off for Mars, manned mission, and neither one of those things has happened. And
no,
it may be that the first men to go back to the moon will be Chinese, because they've got an active program.
Being born and raised in North Alabama, I had an experience when I was really young with my dad. Got to sit in the living room in Huntsville of Warner von Braun's house with him and his wife. I was just a kid.
Yeah.
But I remember my dad telling me how disappointed Warner von Braun was with the direction that they went.
I'm not surprised. Remember that the goal of getting to the moon, and it was a courageous one, was a political one. We were losing the Cold War. Americans may forget that the first satellite was Russian. The first craft to go around the moon was Russian. The first animal was carried aloft by a Russian rocket. The first human went up in a Russian rocket. We were losing our reputation as being the can-do, outfit. So when Kennedy came along with this brash new goal and objective, and it was done very cleverly, by the end of this decade, this was in 1963, so that gave us time to do a lot of other subsidiary goals without justifying them. And we went on, even though we lost 3 guys on the pad. Remember the fire?
Right.
We still kept going. Exploration has risks. And, like it or not, we're going to keep going. And we succeeded. But then what? We don't have the next step. What wasn't there to be taken? And I don't know why.
Well, what you suggested, I've heard suggested before, is that somewhere, somehow, we were warned to back off.
Well, that's not as irrational as it might sound to some people. Let's face it, the backside of the moon would be a great place to have a base for an alien supply base. The mothership goes there, drops off supplies. Nobody from Earth can't hear them talking on their radios, if you will. Can't see what's going on because we can't see the backside of the moon unless we put a rocket around it. We don't do that very often, and governments control what gets released. Clementine was one.
When you were talking about the Russians beating us in the space race, it reminded me of when I first went to university, I took Russian.
Yep.
As my foreign language.
Well, sure. A lot of people did. I took a course in Russian for scientists, believe it or not, at the University of California, Berkeley, because, hey, that's going to be the language I'll need to know.
That's it. Stan, we're down to like 6 minutes here. There's so many, you've got such experience and knowledge base that you've built over the years. Do you have any more books in the works?
Well, I'm working with Kathleen Marden on possibly another book. I'm not going to say much about it, but we'll be getting together at a conference coming up, and we have some ideas. Let's put it that way.
Okay. Now, I heard that there's a possible movie, that there was a screenplay or something.
Well, 2 of my books, Top Secret Magic and Captured, have been optioned for movies. That means they pay a little money and they keep somebody else from making the movie. Now, there hasn't been a lot of progress, but I've heard good things. The guy who arranged the deal says there's interest. No money yet, but there's interest. So I'm hoping, look, I'm 80 years old. I'm hoping it gets made before I die, for goodness sakes. Magic Men would be the name of it, incidentally, of the one about top secret magic. MAJIC, men. And so, that's exciting, but I don't sit around waiting for the check because it'll be some time. But, I'm hoping that the scientific community will get a little more involved than they have been in the past, partly because of MUFON and others. And I'm still an optimist, believe it or not. So good things are going to happen.
Stan, over the years, I started to say decades, that I've listened to you on the radio and whatnot, the excitement that exudes from your voice, the passion you have, has not slowed down one bit. When you talk about this subject, you're as excited as you were 30 years ago.
Can you think of anything more exciting than visitations from outer space? My goodness. How could I not be enthusiastic?
and that is good for the ufology community and for the way it represents itself. And, if we could get all these people together and kind of had a united base with this instead of this competition thing going on. They should vote you president of whatever club that is.
Well, look, I'm still, as I say, optimistic. And I will put a lot of suggestions in my MUFON paper for September at University of California, Irvine. Well, it's going to be in Irvine, right near where the UCI is. And I'm hoping we'll get some younger people. California is a good place for that. Plenty of people in that area. And I'm an enthusiast. Why not? You never got ahead by saying, "No, it can't be done," or "I won't do it," or "I won't bother," or "It's impossible." The original name for the book, Science Was Wrong, was going to be "It's Impossible, Isn't It?" And
Dan, I cannot stop the clock, and the countdown on my screen here is getting down to 2 minutes. I want to remind everybody that this is Abnormal Radio. Stanton Friedman has been my special guest, and I got to tell you, I've done all sorts of interviews, and I have looked forward to, and I'm so excited you agreed to do this. But the website is StantonFriedman.com. Any last minute words you want to give in this 1 minute, 53 seconds?
Well, yes, I'd like to say to people that it's exciting to be part of the world at a time when it's beginning to recognize that we're not alone, that there are a lot of places out there that our great-grandchildren might be able to get to those places. What we need is the will to get together with other people on this planet and start meeting our needs instead of the demigods' needs. It makes me very sad when I hear all the wars going on in the world. And it's time we spend as much effort to make peace and to meet our needs as we do to make war. Contrary to what's best for mankind, to think about war first and peace and prosperity second. So I want to urge people to recognize that we need to grow up. We're young people in the universe. We need to mature. That's my message. Let's get more mature. I'm getting older.
I think it was Winston Churchill that said, "Do away with politics and organized religion, and you would do away with 90% of the dissension in the world."
Well, you're probably right. Wouldn't surprise me. And get rid of the hate.
That's it.
And
Stan, thank you so much. I hope I can have you on again sometime. We got 20 seconds left. I can say good night, and thank you so much for allowing us this 2 hours tonight. It's been such a pleasure, and I look forward to talking to you again.
Okay.
This show will
Thanks much.
Okay.
Okay.